January 1st, 1945, Euro 920, Y-29 Ash Airfield, Belgium. Major George Prey Jr. races across the tarmac toward his P-51 Mustang as German fighters rake the runway with cannon and machine gun fire. Parked planes erupt in black fire. Fuel drums blossom into secondary explosions. In 60 seconds, Operation Bodenplatte, Germany's last great air onslaught, has gutted a dozen Allied fighters where they sat. Prey hurls himself into his Mustang, spins the starter, and the Packard Merlin coughs and dies. He cranks again. Nothing. Behind him, 3 FW-190s line up for another pass. What Prey cannot see, what no one yet knows, is that the ammo belts feeding his guns are nearly empty. Across 8 Allied airfields in Belgium and France, the same story repeats. 50 caliber reserves dangerously low, supply convoys delayed, and 900 German aircraft bearing down on strips that can barely return fire. December's figures are grim. The Ardennes offensive has devoured ammunition at unheard-of rates. Artillery stocks at 89% of monthly allocation used, small arms rounds 76% gone, and aircraft ammunition down to just 18 days' supply, far below the safe 60-day buffer. Supply officers telegraph Supreme Headquarters. Consumption unsustainable. Recommend rationing. But you can't save rounds when the Luftwaffe launches its largest operation in 18 months. By WWII on January 1st, German strikes have scorched 156 Allied planes on 11 airfields. Pilots scramble with whatever rounds remain. Some Mustangs carrying a mere 200 rounds per gun, enough for roughly 4 seconds of fired bursts. Against 900 attackers, that's arithmetic for suicide. Then, in a captured German warehouse near Liège, an ordnance sergeant makes a discovery that will break the rules. His name? Staff Sergeant Robert Bob Capa, not the famous photographer, but a different Robert Capa from Gary, Indiana, a one-time auto mechanic who enlisted in 1942 because, as he later put it seemed like the thing to do. In 72 hours, Capa's improbable fix will turn desperate Allied pilots into the deadliest aerial force the war had yet seen, shooting down more than 300 German aircraft in 10 days and forcing a rethink of how logistics decide battles. Technically, what he's about to attempt is treason. Practically, it will help win the war. The ammunition crisis didn't appear overnight. Since D-Day, Allied forces had raced faster than supply could follow. The Red Ball Express, hauling 2,500 tons daily, was built for steady advances, not for the breakneck 400-mile push in 30 days after Normandy AS breakout. By September 1944, ammo shortfalls stalled Patton's Third Army. Patton's blunt assessment: "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks can't fight without shells." December's Battle of the Bulge turned scarcity into emergency. From December 16, 1944 to January 7, 1945, American units fired more artillery than in the entire North African campaign. Hundreds of thousands of howitzer rounds, millions of small arms rounds. Factories chugged, but production lagged consumption. Of the 8 billion small arms rounds America produced annually, 60% went to ground forces, 25% to the Pacific, leaving only 15% for European air operations. Rationing seemed the only rational choice. Conserve what you have. Wait for convoys. But the Germans were not pausing. Adolf Galland and Luftwaffe planners conceived Operation Bodenplatte to be decisive. Simultaneous strikes on every major Allied airfield, destroy aircraft on the ground, seize air superiority, and buy the Wehrmacht time to consolidate. German intelligence estimated Allied fighters at roughly 2,570 serviceable planes. Destroy 500 and the balance could shift. Allied commanders agreed the best response was absorption. Take the blows, minimize losses, rebuild. A defensive, survival-first doctrine. General Karl Spatz's orders filtered down. Engage only with ammunition levels sufficient to complete missions. Don't waste rounds, survive. But survival requires bullets. Allied pilots watched German chatter and movements and knew a massive sortie was coming. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group wrote on December 30th, "We re-down to 280 rounds per gun. Standard is 400. If Jerry hits hard, We going to die because some supply officer in Paris couldn't get trucks to the front. On December 31st, 8th Air Force warned Washington. Emergency airlift of 50 caliber stocks requested. Logistical constraints forbid it. Next convoy due January 8th, a week away. Operation Bodenplatte would begin in 12 hours. At captured supply depot Leupold, 15 miles southeast of Liège, Staff Sergeant Kappa was cataloging enemy materiel, rifles, MGs, shells, medical stores, when he opened Warehouse 7, Bunker C. Inside, sealed tins stamped with Reich Eagles, and inside those tins, 240,000 rounds of German 20mm MG 151-20 ammunition. Ammunition that at first glance Allied gunners couldn't use. Or could they? Bob Kappa's life before the Army taught him to see parts the way a mechanic sees bolt and bearing, measure, compare, adapt. He pulled a German 20mm round from its crate, measured length and diameter, weighed the projectile. Then he compared it to American 20mm M2 rounds. The dimensions weren't identical, but they weren't impossibly different either. The German projectiles had heavier charges and higher muzzle velocity, but the bore diameter was the same nominally, 20 millimeters. If nothing else, the parts were close enough to inspire a reckless idea. Could captured German 20mm be adapted to fire from American aircraft cannons? The sane answer was no. Different rims, different feeds, different pressures. The lot of it was incompatible. But Kappa wasn't reasoning by manual. He was reasoning by metal and measurement. If you can't change the shells, change the chamber. He imagined a simple adapter sleeve, a brass ring turned to precise tolerances that would let the German round seat properly in an American M2 chamber. It was illegal by the book. It might blow barrels, kill airmen, and earn court-martials. But if it worked, 240,000 rounds would suddenly be usable. In a field workshop, a barn converted to a makeshift machine shop, Kappa set to work. He disassembled an intact German MG 151-20 and an American M2 cannon from salvaged airframes, laid components side by side, and began to machine an adapter. He turned brass on a lathe, checked calipers, filed until the tolerances read true. 11 hours later, exhausted and fingers raw, he had a sleeve that fit. At 05 hour on January 1st, 1945, he test-fired a modified M2 against sandbags. The gun bellowed. The German shell struck home, the chamber held. No cracks. No catastrophic failure. He fired 5 more rounds. Success. Captain Wesley Hoffman, Kappa's CO, found him surrounded by casings and brass at 0630. You remodifying American cannons to fire enemy shells? Hoffman barked. Kappa's answer was simple. We're out of ammunition. They're attacking in 2 hours. I can give pilots rounds. Hoffman understood the stakes. One test meant nothing, but the alternative was certain defeat. He ordered Kappa to make as many adapters as possible and drove the short, illegal chain of command higher. By 0930, Bodenplatte was rolling. At Y-29 Ash, Minters and Mustangs burned in the grass. Across the theater, 156 Allied aircraft were destroyed on the ground before pilots could get airborne. Yet some fighters did climb, about 350, and they faced 900 German attackers with minimal ammo. Many expended their belts in under 2 minutes. It was desperation. Back at the workshop, Kappa and a handful of mechanics worked machines in fevered shifts. By 1330, they had 28 adapters. Captain Hoffman raced them to 9th Air Force headquarters at Verviers. Operations officers, legal men, and generals debated feverishly. Ballistics engineers warned of mismatched pressures and potential weapon failure. JAG officers muttered about Geneva violations. Logistics officers said resupply was days away. Major General Hoy Vandenberg made the call. Retrofit the guns. If it failed, careers, and perhaps lives, would be forfeit. If it worked, the fighters might survive. By mid-afternoon on January 1st, mechanics were fitting brass sleeves into P-38 and P-61 20mm M2 cannon chambers. Lieutenant Richard Pete Peterson watched an adapter go into his P-38. His left gun stayed loaded with the last American rounds, his right now fed with German shells, black-tipped, Waffen-stamped. At 16:00, a dozen modified P-38s took off to patrol. At 16:42, Peterson's flight engaged Bf-109s near Luxembourg. One standard burst from his left cannon damaged a Messerschmitt. A follow-up from the modified right gun, German shells, detonated the 109 in mid-air. Peterson stared at the sight. It worked. Over the next minutes, those P-38s shot down several enemy fighters with captured ammunition. Systems held. Barrels stayed true. Within 2 days, crews had retrofitted dozens of fighters. Kappa's stash of 240,000 German rounds was distributed. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Pilots who had been conserving every round now had belts to burn, could pursue, could press, could force engagements rather than flee. Kill ratios changed. Where earlier engagements had seen Allied pilots nibble at opportunities, now they rained fire. Combat logs from January show the swing. In the hours before the modification, Allied fighters faced 350 attackers with deeply limited ammo and suffered proportionally heavy losses. After the retrofits, from January 1-10, Allied squadrons equipped with adapted cannons claimed nearly 298 German aircraft destroyed, while suffering a fraction of their prior attrition. The Luftwaffe's losses escalated. Adolf Galland's after-action summary on January 11th lamented tactical success, but operational failure. "We destroyed aircraft on the ground, yes, but Allied fighters fought back with ammunition resources far beyond our estimates." Galland's report concluded, "Suspend large-scale operations. Fighter arm effectiveness slumped some 40% in 10 days. The raw math told the story. Where previous engagements averaged a kill ratio around 2.6.1, with standard ammunition and constrained belts, operations with captured German shells pushed that ratio far higher. Allied pilots could expend more rounds per engagement, press kills, and survive. Over the 10 days, Allied pilots shot down scores of German fighters that otherwise would have continued to contest the skies and threaten ground forces. Post-war analysis estimated that without the captured ammunition, Allied losses in January might have been 150-200 aircraft higher, with hundreds more pilot casualties. There were moral and legal shadows. Using enemy munitions and modified weapons sat uneasily in doctrine and law. Engineers fretted, lawyers scowled, and commanders privately feared reprisals for precedent. But in field reports and pilot diaries, gratitude drowned out caution. Lieutenant Colonel Hubska wired Captain Hoffman on January 10th. "Your sergeant's modification saved this operation. We held the line when we had no ammunition. Tell him we came home because of what he built." Staff Sergeant Robert E. Kappa never sought fame. After VE Day, he went back to Gary, reopened his mechanic's stall, fixed cars, changed oil, and kept his Bronze Star in a drawer. When Army investigators later reviewed the improvised adapters, their report, Field Expedient Solution, praised the mechanical ingenuity and recommended commendation. Kappa accepted a Bronze Star, shrugged, and returned to the quietly practical life he'd always known. When the Smithsonian asked for his original sleeve in 1965, he admitted he'd thrown it away. He died in 1987. His obituary was 4 sentences. But his idea did not die. The adaptation, a simple brass sleeve turned in a barn workshop, became a case study at Aberdeen Proving Ground and entered joint logistics doctrine as a lesson in adaptive use of captured material. The term "pulling a Kappa" slipped into field parlance. In later conflicts, U.S. forces would again retrofit weapons to fire captured ordnance in practical improvisations born of necessity. The wider lesson transcends metallurgy and ballistics. It's about practical problem-solving under pressure. When supply chains fail, doctrine falters, and lives hang in the balance, sometimes the right answer is the one the manuals disallow. Engineers and mechanics in makeshift shops can bend rules and save lives. They can take the enemy's tools and turn them back on him. Bob Kappa's work was technically illicit, potentially dangerous, and morally ambiguous, and it helped tip the scales when the margins were razor-thin. January 10, 1945. The Luftwaffe's offensive momentum had collapsed. The captured ammunition and the field expedient adapters did not end the war, but they bluntly altered the course of a critical winter. Allied pilots reclaimed the skies, protected ground troops during counteroffensives, and ensured the Bulge did not become a gateway to prolonging the war into 1946. The production numbers and kill tallies record what the workshop's lathes cannot. Hundreds of enemy aircraft destroyed, dozens of air crews spared, and a logistics doctrine reshaped by improvisation. History remembers generals and pilots, battles and strategies. It seldom remembers the mechanic in the barn who measured metal and ignored a manual, but the archives keep a brass sleeve behind glass. Not quite Kappa's original, but a reproduction with a simple placard. Field-modified 20mm cannon adapter, January 1945. Enabled use of captured German ammunition during critical shortage. Developed by SSGT Robert E. Kappa, 497th Ordnance Heavy Maintenance Company. Few stop to read it, but ordnance specialists do. Military logisticians teach it. Soldiers whisper the lesson. When doctrine fails, ingenuity can win the day. The moral is blunt. Sometimes rules cost lives. Sometimes courage is not a charge, but a lathe, a caliper, and the nerve to try something forbidden when everything else is exhausted. Staff Sergeant Robert Kappa took that risk. The Luftwaffe learned it the hard way.